Okay, so this is Movie Thoughts. I'm John Hastings. We're back for episode 30. It's been another couple weeks. I'm still off schedule. And, we've got I guess I have a Facebook page, Movie Thoughts Podcast. And I've got my reviews on Letterboxd under the username Forager23. And then we have the YouTube channel. And yeah, as I said, this is episode 30. And, last episode was about journalism, and it was inspired by me seeing Richard Jewell last year. And so I thought of that idea for that episode back when I saw that movie, and then it took me months to make the episode. This is similar. This episode is inspired by me watching the movie El Camino last year, the Netflix Breaking Bad sequel. And I'm just getting around to making this episode about it now. So I kind of was thinking about, El Camino came out and it was on Netflix, and um, some people were kind of saying like, oh, this is just, is this really deserve to be a movie? Is it can it kind of stand alone? Is it cinematic? Is it just a long episode of a TV show? What is this thing? And I really liked it a lot. First of all, I'll say that. And the discussion got me thinking of this idea of this boundary, maybe artificial, between movies and television, or whether cinema and television, and this idea that there's a big difference between something with like a televisual style versus a cinematic style, which different people have made arguments towards that, and one way or the other over the years. And I think the idea that it's kind of all in a, I think the least controversial thing to say is it's kind of all on a spectrum, and to a certain extent, the telling stories with moving pictures and actors and everything, it kind of sort of doesn't matter whether you could say it doesn't matter if it's in a 90-minute chunk that resolves, or it's in 10 60-minute chunks that may or may not continue for another 10 60-minute chunks. So, the differences between those things, there might be differences that have to do with the audience or the financing or the conventions, but to a certain extent you should say, well, those should be the same type of thing when we get down to the essence. In practice, I think we end up just meaning we're kind of, these are more socially constructed concepts, even something that's cinematic. We're not really talking about the essence of art forms, but something that's, words to kind of give value to something. And I'll maybe by just kind of explaining more what I mean, that'll start to make sense. So I think this argument kind of gets back to this idea of, the Sopranos ushered in. We'll go back to the Sopranos. Everything goes to there, right? The Sopranos ushered in this kind of golden age of television, where all of a sudden TV went from something that was like maybe okay, or maybe you sort of watched as a guilty pleasure, to the central narrative storytelling art form for adults in America. So it was no longer movies, which we're seeing more and more as being aimed at kids, or aimed at giving us mindless spectacle. It was no longer movies. It was no longer novels. People just kind of weren't reading, or the novels that were being pushed as being culturally significant by kind of cultural gatekeepers were not the same type of kind of, we're not providing that type of storytelling experience, that experience of like being engaged in a long story that people kind of find broadly appealing. During this time, the big novels that everyone were reading were like the Harry Potter novels, and you can kind of say a lot about. There's a lot of reasons to kind of be, to kind of push back against this idea of the Harry Potter novels in a lot of ways, but they seem to be fulfilling a need for this kind of people like these kind of long stories that were not necessarily being, were not necessarily the same type of novels being pushed by like the New York Times as like notable books of the year, which often were more impressionistic or more about getting across a certain character or state of mind or even a theme, rather than kind of tell these big long stories. I guess I would say like the era of like Lonesome Dove as a as a novel that maybe would be widely read versus read by specialists or read by a small audience is long gone. So with The Sopranos, you have this kind of combination of these long novel-like stories going on, and that and with kind of this movie style cinematic maybe production values. So it looks shiny, the actors are really good, it's filmed, they're filmed like little movies, or kind of hour-long movies each episode. So you have kind of the best of both worlds, and it became something people were genuinely, this, I don't think it's like a marketing thing. People were like duped into watching The Sopranos. Genuinely, The Sopranos hit on a formula. Calling it a formula is even the wrong, kind of putting it the wrong way for what those guys were doing. They hit on a genuine need. They uncovered that people really were desiring to watch, these kind of grown-ups, elaborate stories for grown-ups with like nice, production values, kind of combining what you used to, ideally used to be able to get from the movies like Goodfellas or The Godfather, and what you used to be able to get from big novels like either the Godfather novel or something like Lonesome Dove. So it kind of combines that stuff that wasn't really was. You can say like, well, there's movies for grown-ups were still around, but they weren't central in the same way, and novels with big stories were still around, but they weren't quite as central, and people weren't reading anyways. So this ushers in the so-called golden age of TV, and I think, this is where I start to push back, and where people are so invested in this idea of the golden age of TV that if you push back even a little bit or have some skepticism, they have been accused of just being this crazy contrarian and just like, not just kind of reflexively not liking this because other people like it. So regardless, I'm just trying to push back a little bit and be a little bit skeptical, which is to say that one, most of the TV that followed wasn't as good as The Sopranos. By some of it fell short just by a little bit, but a lot of it fell short by a lot, and a lot of it was very derivative, and a lot of it fell into sort of the problem of being not very interesting to watch. Kind of once you got through kind of the basic kind of watching the plot unfold, like, oh, what's going to happen with the story, as something to kind of sit and hold your attention in terms of how it was made, tended to not be that interesting. There's a couple exceptions, but not too many. But what was important to people was, now, and what really pushed this idea of the golden age of TV was like, now people are actually talking about it. Even if it's at least there's grown-ups watching these stories, and we can all talk about it, and it's like this big cultural moment, and there wasn't an example of people talking about grown-up movies in the same way, with the same interest and the same attention. So it had hit on something. I just don't necessarily think it was that interesting. And then it ended up kind of feeding into itself, where these shows started to be designed so you could talk about them, I think, not for any other reason. So you have shows like, I would characterize, and I don't want to be too controversial or pick on people's favorite shows, I would characterize maybe a show like Westworld from HBO, which seems to be designed mainly to set up these plot points that you talk about, but really is not super interesting in terms of the filmmaking, or even in terms of the themes, which are not really original to it. Or I'm okay with things that aren't original, but the whole presentation is more about getting you to talk about it and getting you to think about like, oh, what's going to happen next, rather than to engage with what actually is happening. It's not, you're not deeply engaged with what's going on in Westworld. The question is like, oh, what are they going to do next? What are we going to find out next about this universe? And I think that's leads to kind of boring, whatever we're going to call it, whether it's cinema or boring TV. It is a boring thing to watch. So in this whole whole debate, then people start pushing back and say like, well, these shows aren't cinematic. For example, like I'm into cinema, and these shows aren't cinematic. And then it becomes hard to say like, what does that even mean? Like I mentioned, a big part of what I think people mean when it's used sort of um, when people say that The Sopranos is like a movie or Westworld is like a movie, we're just talking about the production values. So if we want to say like move beyond this idea of the production values being important, let's not be quite as superficial. Although I get that that's a big part of their appeal, but let's not be superficial about it. So I tend to think of it as a spectrum, and not that there's like something that's cinematic or not necessarily. But if we're saying I'm going to use cinematic to mean there's the people making it, or we're watching it with a eye to not just what it's about, or even not primarily what it's about, but how it is about what it's about. So that how it's about is happening on a certain spectrum of interest. Is it more or less of interest to us? Like if it's pretty conventional and straightforward, maybe like less interesting. Whereas if the how it's about what it's about is interesting, I would say like that's when we start to say like, well, that's cinematic. And I think traditionally that's because you know we TV tended to be more industrialized in terms of the how we're going to tell this story than movies. Not that movies weren't conventionalized or industrialized in the same way, but movies tended, especially if you're coming from a tourist perspective, tended to have opportunities to be more inventive in terms of the how question, how that's going to be about what it's about. Okay, so as I said, I then if we then think though, kind of getting back to this, all these imitators and of The Sopranos, and you think about that question of like, what are these shows have actually been really interesting in terms of how they make meaning, not just kind of what the next plot is or what's going to happen in the story or what's happening to that character, but how they're making meaning. You come up with a much smaller subset of TV shows, like these TV type things, even if they're like streaming. So, which is a whole other maybe a whole other issue. You come up with a smaller set of them that I think are really interesting, and which is not to say that the other ones that are more plot driven are without interest or whatever. But I think for me at least they are less interesting. And I think for a lot of people who are kind of movie fans or traditional movie fans, classic movie fans, whatever you want to call it. And then that smaller group would include things like clearly something like the third season of Twin Peaks, which is all directed by David Lynch, and which is very much not that the things have to be all directed by one person or needs to have an auteur in the same way, but it's clear that he's very concerned with how he's telling that story and not just what is happening. I think if you focus, I don't think you can get too much enjoyment out of the third season of Twin Peaks if you're focused really just on kind of what is happening. I think you have to tune into, on the wavelength of how it's happening and appreciate that to really engage with that show. Some other examples that people, I think I'm the only one who kind of points these out, but I think are actually really similar to, or not really similar to Twin Peaks, but are like Twin Peaks, present a kind of really unified, coherent work that even though they're broken into episodes, they are really like these kind of long movies in a way in terms of the way they go about what they do. Would be the two Wet Hot American Summer mini series or series from Netflix, the prequel and the sequel, and both of those are really interesting and fascinating in the way they play around with conventions of how time and pacing happens in movies and TV. It's a really kind of, they're very funny too. Straightforwardly, they're just very funny, but there's sort of these really sophisticated explorations of storytelling technique in movies and film, or in movies and TV. So we get to those things, you know, and then it's a little harder. I think the Starz TV show Spartacus, I think, was a great example of a show with a really strong style had something really going for it. It felt a little bit like kind of though it was kind of hyped up with this kind of CGI, hyper CGI realism. There was a part of it that was also sort of abstracted and stripped down like a one of Bud Bedeker's westerns. So it had a great kind of push pull in that sense. I like that show. And then, of course, the topic of this, the Vince Gilligan shows, Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, and then El Camino. And I think that the kind of mainline post Sopranos shows that kind of people got talking about and got really into, I do think kind of Breaking Bad, and even more so Better Call Saul, which I think is the better show, are the only ones that really live up to The Sopranos in terms of being interesting as cinema, as interesting in terms of how they're going about what they're doing. And I haven't seen all the shows, and so I'm happy to take suggestions. But you're probably trust me, you're probably going to tell me about a show that I think is really just about plot. So you got to sort of be careful, or at least be a little bit thoughtful about like why you're doing this. But because I'm going to tell you, because it's got to live up to what Breaking Bad is doing, and I don't think it is, or Better Call Saul rather. And what is that specifically? So I'm going to talk about what makes these shows so interesting. And I don't know who there's a bunch of people involved in the making of those shows, and it didn't start necessarily at the beginning with Breaking Bad, although it was there, but this element became a structuring principle in Breaking Bad as it went on, and it is the center of Breaking and Better Call Saul and El Camino. So at some point, whoever's idea it was, it got picked up on and became like, this is how we're going to make these shows. And essentially, there's this is how I think about these shows. There's that William Carlos Williams kind of line from the poem. There's no ideas but in things, and the way that these Vince Gilligan shows work is that there is no drama but in things, because almost every single major development in these shows, major points, whether it's a way to characterize someone or the kind of how the plot is progressing or to express a theme, is dramatized somehow through a character's relationship or with a physical object. So like a prop, maybe a piece of the set, a building, and then so you look back through. For example, I mean, I'm behind on Better Call Saul because I don't, even though it's like one of my favorite shows. Probably I don't like to binge, so I'm like a season behind, or 2 seasons behind. I don't even know, but I like to take it slowly. I think about the third season of Better Call Saul, where you have all of these kind of props or objects that just get all this meaning, or a lot of meaning is made out of them. There's like the cassette tape, there's the cap for the gas tank, a pair of sneakers, there's like a coffee mug that doesn't like fit, an old video store, there's a pill bottle, there's another pair of sneakers, there's a cell phone battery, there's the lantern. So there's all of these objects that different aspects of the character or the story are kind of dramatized by, and they become very important. And you can see that it makes it a kind of it makes it a more interesting show than just people kind of talking to each other or things getting across based on who's saying what to whom. It has to do, we see things, we see character revealed or themes explored by like these objects and how they're being used. So it's not just the show's not delivering a script. This is real cinema, is what I would say. And like I said, I just started watching the fourth season, and I can kind of make that theory up, and then you can kind of, the theory gets better and better in your head. Sometimes the theories get better and better in your head the farther away you move from actually watching whatever you're watching. But then I went back and just recently watched, I said, the first episode of the fourth season, and it's all over the place again. And that thing about the coffee mug not fitting in the third season comes back because now in the fourth season, the first episode, they can show this very minor side character, and they can kind of instantly characterize him by showing that he has a coffee mug that fits perfectly in his car's cup holder. And that tells us all we need. It becomes this shorthand for telling us all we need to know about this character. So it's a very sophisticated use of film of kind of storytelling that you don't get from some of these other purely like plot script talking to each other shows. Okay, so El Camino, then, it was just this whole thing started when I was watching El Camino. Really does the same thing. It's the story is driven by the characters, the way they have to deal with, the way they have to kind of transport, cover up, they have to get rid of stuff. So they've got to, it's all about physical stuff. Sometimes that's in that movie. Sometimes it's there's a lot of different things make up that stuff, but they've got to deal with that stuff, and there's not too many other like I said, I mean, the shows who do this, and you think of like other filmmakers who kind of have this consideration of stuff and like how characters deal with stuff in such a way. I start to think of someone like Claire Denis, or her movie The White Material, and you think of The White Material, and if you haven't seen that movie, it's worth checking out. But it's you are required by watching it, it kind of jumps around in time a bit, and you can only kind of tell the time frame you're in some instances by like looking at how decayed certain objects that repeat, or kind of how worn down certain objects that repeat in the different timelines are. You kind of have to pay attention to that. Anyways, and in the title, it's like the white material. She's telling us like pay attention to the material stuff. But the white material could also be like a name of like, if not, we wouldn't be a great title for Breaking Bad, but you could certainly write some type of book about Breaking Bad called The White Material, and it actually would fit because Breaking Bad is about Walter White. Having said that, what I want to just get back to is this idea that that you don't see, that's a real filmmaking idea, to kind of put everything on in terms of, to make everything dramatized in terms of how people are dealing with stuff. It isn't about, it isn't just about talking. You can't do that if we're thinking about like cinematic versus theatrical versus other stuff. You can't do that in a play very easily. It's something that's well suited to cinema. Okay, so I really like El Camino. I think it is a real movie. Does it, do you, in terms of like the plot, do you need to have watched all of Breaking Bad to really appreciate it? Does it have kind of plot power without having seen Breaking Bad? No, I don't think so. Obviously, it's a sequel. You need to be familiar with the stuff to really get into it. But in terms of the technique, in terms of how it goes about what it's about, I think it's a really brilliant as a standalone movie, and I think it would hold up as a standalone movie, even if you didn't know all that stuff, because it is so focused on how it's because how it's made is so interesting, and it's really made with thought and style. Anyways, that's kind of all I had to say. It was a little bit rambling maybe, but I'd rather get a rambling episode out there than no episode out there. So maybe I said something interesting. Hopefully I did. And maybe I said something you want to argue with me about, and that's fine too. Anyways, I will talk to you later. Take care.